several people who are just tremendous experts in messaging and how to talk about immigrants and refugees, who have many years of experience doing this at various levels. First, I'd like to bring up Lynn Tremonte, who is from Cleveland, Ohio. I believe right now she's in Washington, D.C. She's the Deputy Director of Washington-based America's Voice. Lynn develops press strategy and messaging techniques and has 17 years experience in translating research into practical communication strategies. Welcome, Lynn Tremonte. Joining
Hello.
us from Georgia. Hi, Lynn. Joining us from Georgia is Welcoming America's Hannah Carswell, head of their Welcoming Refugees project. Hannah focuses on messaging and contact building. She brings proven strategies that build more welcoming and understanding from the nationwide Welcoming America network. Welcome, Carswell. And from Long Beach, California is Julie Fisher-Rao, Senior Framing and Messaging Coordinator at the Opportunity Agenda, an expert in research-based messaging techniques that generate more positive conversation. Julie helps social justice groups hone in on the right messages for their goals and their audience, and she's a longtime presenter with us. Nice to have you back, Julie Fisher-Rao. I wanted to just dive straight into this and put it in the context of what is happening right now. A lot of people out there probably think they have very logical and fair arguments in support of the recent executive orders, such as, they target only undocumented immigrants, not those here lawfully, or they're simply enforcing existing laws. How should we frame our responses to what seem to some people to be very logical and fair arguments?
We just heard that you should tell a system story, and with the refugee and Muslim ban, you're talking about people who did what they were supposed to do. They followed a process to get a legal visa. They went through the vetting requirements, the background checks, they paid their fees, et cetera. And then when they show up at our doors, somebody else from our government is saying, I'm sorry, you're not welcome here. So the problem I have, and I'd love to hear from other panelists, is that if we say, they came here, they did what we asked them to do, and then our government shuts them out, then it implies that there are other people that aren't doing it the quote-unquote right way. So instead, it's rather than stressing sort of the process, what we have been talking about is just, this isn't the type of country we want to be. This is not the values that America was founded on, that you discriminate against people based on their countries of origin or their religion, and that you keep people out who really need protection. So we've been talking more about our values, but I'd be interested in hearing from Julie and others about, how they grapple with that.
Hannah, you deal particularly with refugees and creating more welcoming environments for them. How do you respond to people who think that they're being very reasonable in their response and very level-headed?
So I'd say when you're handling these kinds of questions, it's really important to emphasize how we all miss out when we're divided. So always emphasizing the positive. For instance, our communities are safer when people feel like they belong, when families aren't fearful that they're going to be separated, and when people feel safe to report crimes. And so we all want to live in safe and connected communities, and these executive orders are, and like the environment right now, are undermining that safety and connectivity that we have. And so rather than focusing on status, we've just been focusing on the importance of coming together and talking about how the recent orders feed the rhetoric of fear and distrust in the United States and marginalize new Americans who want to contribute to their communities and country. And then when we stand up for people whose liberties and lives are at risk, we're affirming our values, and we're modeling them for the world at a time when it's really needed. And then just also talking about how building inclusive and welcoming communities means doing the hard work of listening to all of our neighbors and building community with everyone who's in our community, and because everyone who's here has something to contribute socially, culturally, economically. So it's important to stand with everyone and just always focusing on those messages of unity and how it's important not to leave anyone in our communities behind.
Right. You mentioned, messages of unity, and I know a lot of the work that you do, your mantra is like stronger together and being more welcoming. But we're up against a very, very robust fear-based narrative, and I'm wondering if we have more powerful messages to counter that fear-based narrative. It's terror, it's your job security, it's law and order. Marissa, perhaps you can shed some light on that very specific fear-based narrative.
So I think when people get into that talk about security, with the best way to counter that is to talk about more pragmatic solutions. I don't think that building a wall, and I think that there's lots of agreement about this, building a wall is not the proper solution to keeping people safe. Integrating immigrants into our communities is the proper way to keep our communities safe. And so therefore we should be providing a pathway to citizenship for the people who are here. So just, focusing on that sort of, we need a more pragmatic approach, and then offering the real solutions instead of those punitive things like building a wall or deporting 11 million people, which is just, that's not common sense.
How do you counter that fear-based narrative, Julie?
Sure. And so, first of all, I completely agree with what Dr. Pinot said about, countering with a pragmatic frame with this idea of common sense, that we actually know the way forward, very solution-oriented, because the last thing we need to do is make that fear even deeper or get people even more worked up. So try and find ways to be talking about, well, what we really need to be thinking about is, what can we do to move forward, but also what kind of country do we want to be? Because a lot of what's happening, what's being said right now, is actually in direct counter, violates our values and is not the kind of country we want to be. And, we're doing a little bit of research on that right now, and we're finding that there are some ways to counter this. And, one is by reminding people that we are a country that's diverse, that we're better off when people contribute and participate, that we're better when we put our heads together and figure out how to solve problems than when we try to either draw lines or allow other people to divide us. And so really finding ways to remind people of, because as Dr. Pinot said, we can have two conflicting ideas in our heads at the same time. And so it's really up to us as communicators to start the story in the way that brings out the values and the solutions that we want our audiences to be thinking about. And the more we can do that, the more we can set them on the road to accept and think about our solutions, rather than go down other roads that are less productive and more harmful to us.
So I would like to find out what messages we should be giving people, constituents, to give to their legislators. And I think you mentioned some of them now. What would you add to that, Lynn?
Let me think what I add to that. I think just picking up on what Julie said, this is not the type of country we want to be, where we're tearing moms and dads away from their kids, where there's a climate of fear in our communities, where people are afraid of law enforcement, people are afraid that they are not going to be there when their children come home from school. And that's just, that we want to be connected. We want strong societies, strong families. Immigrants come here to build strong families. But what Donald Trump is doing is trying to make them afraid and fearful, so that he can control them. And that's not the America that we want to live in.
And I'm thinking of, I presented a bunch of facts earlier. There's so much data that shows how immigrants contribute and how collectively we benefit. And I remember in our last webinar on how to use data to advance change, Amanda Burks and Shilcock of the National Skills Coalition spoke about remind legislators that, implementing a particular program at a school or for this particular group of immigrants actually generates more income for everyone. It's going to pay more in taxes. It's a shared benefit. So my question would be, exactly how should we be using the facts and the data and the statistics in our messaging? Marissa and Julie?
I think, putting you just basically did a shared prosperity narrative. Like everything you talked about was about how we all benefit economically and socially when we have immigration, right? But, what we've discovered is just asserting that doesn't work. You need to start off with something that'll make people really care about that. It seems intuitive that people would care about us all benefiting economically, but, we've actually discovered that that's not always the case. So you always have to frame your facts. And as you saw in that narrative arc, our testing shows that starting with that moral humanitarian argument that, we are a country that values human dignity, and that's why it is so important that we provide opportunities for immigrants to integrate into our country so that they can become part of, that economic success that we all want. So I would say, always, whenever you have facts, whenever you have data, don't just throw out the data point and expect it again to speak for itself, because the past 18 months have shown us that facts are even perhaps more contested than ever, and that framing is really critical, and making sure that you set up why that fact is important is the best way to do it. So.
Yeah, I agree. Facts are often important, but they're never sufficient. And so one of the structures that we offer to folks in thinking about how to build a message is the idea of starting, it's value, problem, solution, action. So starting with values, thinking about which values actually work in whatever context. Dr. Pinot's pointed out several important ones: compassion and common sense, pragmatism, our shared humanity, all of these things. And then moving to the problem, but not spending as much time as we typically spend on the problem. But this is a place where there can be a few facts to really talk, to show how the problem is violating the values, to show how the problem is not in all of our best interest, and then move quickly to a solution. And this is also another place where a few very carefully chosen statistics or facts can bolster an argument. But again, they're never going to be enough to fully make the argument. And in some cases, they can hurt you because, as Dr. Pinot just said, we're now in a place where people can just question facts more and more. And so to try to find a few really carefully chosen ones, and particularly thinking, who is your given audience, who do they trust, who are they going to pay attention to? And choosing sources very carefully if you're going to use facts and statistics. And then moving on to an action, what can they do right now, especially in advocacy-based messaging, where we are trying to motivate people to do something or to move on something. So that progression can kind of remind you where to use facts and statistics most effectively, but also remind you where to start the conversation most effectively, which is really at that values level. So value, problem, solution, and then action is just one way to think about how to put it all together.
This is Lynn. I wanted to add, in this specific debate about immigration, the facts are that to carry out Donald Trump's mass deportation, you would have to dramatically grow the U.S. government. You would have, and taxpayers would be footing the bill. That's a fact, yet the Republican Party is still pushing it. So it just shows the limitations of facts in the debate. However, you will see over the next several months a debate over spending and funding for these executive orders. And especially Democrats will be raising information about how expensive and costly it is for the taxpayer, not just to families, because it points out the hypocrisy of some of our elected officials who are pushing policies that on the one hand they claim they want smaller government, and to reduce taxes. On the other hand, they're proposing the most dramatic expansion of the federal government in history.
And I want to keep it with you and with Hannah. A lot of us working in the integration or resettlement field have been getting calls from reporters. How should we spoke earlier about sustained messages, about, keeping these messages out there, and the media, of course, and the internet and social media are certainly ways of doing this. Perhaps you, Lynn, and Hannah can give us some strategies on engaging with the media and in order to push a more positive narrative. What ideas do you have for us?
Yeah, we just had a call with a bunch of immigrant advocates from across the country, and a couple great ideas emerged from that call. One of them was to invite reporters to actually experience an immigration process, go into a hearing for either, a reentry prosecution or a civil immigration court hearing. Go to an oath ceremony, sort of sit, and the other piece they said was to not just have the reporter do that experience, but really sort of follow an individual through it and talk to them afterwards as well to see sort of how they're processing what just happened. I mean, if you haven't had to go through a government process where basically your future is in the hands of a bureaucracy, if you haven't experienced that yourself, you might not really understand it. And so that experience based tactic I thought was very important. I know for myself, it's made me see different processes in immigration from a different light once I actually attended a hearing, met the folks who were being prosecuted for illegal reentry, saw the jumpsuits that people, that the men were in, saw the group hearings. I mean, it's something that I'll never forget.
So I would say that it's taking all of these same strategies and being really consistent, and to always be looking for stories that you can share that lead into the points that you want to get out there, to be proactively collecting those so that you have them when you need them, and to just be constantly proactive about pushing out promising practices and positive stories, no matter what the environment's like at the time. It's really a long-term game.
Right, and we even see the need for pushing those stories and encouraging conversations in the classroom. Many of us saw that cell phone video of the children in the cafeteria chanting, "Build that wall," and there's a lot of fear and uncertainty, not just among students themselves, but about fear about themselves, but also about their parents or families. It's affecting the way they're learning, it's affecting their social skills and social development. How do we frame the discussion in the classroom, especially with children, when there's this atmosphere of fear and bullying? What ideas do you have? Perhaps Julie and Hannah?
Sure. So I think that it comes down to the same strategies that we're using in other arenas, because the situation is really a reflection of the larger environment in the U.S. right now. So using storytelling and then moving into talking about the contributions that refugees and immigrants bring to our communities. And then as a staff member at Welcoming America, I have to say that contact building is just such a vital part of it, giving students the opportunities to thoughtfully interact in meaningful ways with students that they wouldn't normally spend time with. It really comes down to breaking down barriers, and then, of course, also finding a way to make to help the students who are the targets of this kind of bullying feel safe while you're doing this. And a resource I would always recommend is Teaching Tolerance for lesson plans that can help teachers bring this kind of discussion into the classroom.
Yeah, and I would just say that another strategy that you can use in a number of different situations, but also in classrooms, is to really appeal to kids' identity, what they see themselves, how they see themselves, if they see themselves as a kid who is against bullying, to point out how you're doing that, this is a part of that, and so you're actually violating your own values by engaging in this. And so, you can say, as kids who are against bullying, we can understand that we need to make everybody feel safe here and that we need to accept everybody for who they are. And just really trying to remind them of what their own values are and that their own behavior needs to follow suit. And I think we can do that in a number of one-on-one conversations to remind people of the kind of folks that we want to be, instead of maybe who they're being encouraged to be by the wrong forces.
This is Lynn. I have 2 kids, and this is just something I really struggle with, because they get the scholastic news or those papers that come home, and Donald Trump was featured in one of them. So your own president is not modeling that constructive behavior, and so I think anybody who can think it through could come up with some ways to talk about kids, but what do you do about the fact that the person they're supposed to look up to doesn't seem to share that same care for how they talk about things?
And I want to get to a few questions from our attendees, but just before I do that, I wanted to ask one final question, which is something that I think many people are grappling with. How do you associate the word refugee, including the word Syrian or Muslim, with American? I will start with the doctor.
So I thought was it yesterday that the sign was hung on the Statue of Liberty saying refugees are welcome. I thought actually that was an extremely powerful image because we are a nation of immigrants, and that is actually a very strong cultural model of our country that Americans have and that we need to activate over and over and over again. Unless you're Native American, your grandparents, great-grandparents, parents, you yourself came to this country as an immigrant. So emphasizing that refugees are following, long history in this country of people coming here who are escaping violence and deprivations, and America welcomes them and integrates them into our society. That's what we do as Americans, I think is what we want to talk about.
Do you agree with that, Hannah?
Yes, I think also adding things like talking about refugees as new Americans or newcomers. I think also bringing up that that refugees, many do become citizens within 5 years of arriving, so there's also always that to add. And then just telling stories that show refugees, Syrians, Muslims as Americans and as an important part of the fabric of our country. So anytime we can just be lifting up those stories, that's the important thing to be doing.
And so we have a couple questions here in our final few minutes. One is directed at you, Marissa, from your presentation. You had mentioned system versus individual approach. Is it therefore counterproductive to use stories about individuals then?
So it can be counterproductive if you're only telling the individual story. The important thing is that when you're talking about individuals, you embed them in a system story. So, it might be that if you're, say, writing a story for a press release or something like that, you start off by talking about the immigration system and the conditions in which that individual ended up coming to this country, and then get into their specific details about that individual. But you always want to make sure that you match the two. Just talking about one person and their situation, their plight, or how they overcame adversity. Americans love to think about things in individual terms. And what they'll end up doing is saying, well, that person was a really good person who worked hard, but then they want to extrapolate that to all other immigrants or all other undocumented people or whatever. So unless you put it in that system story so that people understand that we're not just individuals living in a vacuum relying on our own, intelligence or ability to succeed. We all live in these social systems that affect our choices, and that's really critical.
And we have another question here. Some people are wondering about messages, not necessarily for the anti-immigrant people, but for maybe messages that can help to empower immigrant or supportive communities. What kind of messages do you think would really sort of fire up people to express support, to make themselves visible? Are we seeing it happen with like the Statue of Liberty and resist flying over the White House? What ideas might you all have? Lynn?
I actually wanted to hear what Julie had to say. I feel like I've been talking a lot on this, and I know they've done research, so maybe I'll just pass the mic to Julie.
Yeah, so I mean, I think you're really talking about like what keeps the base motivated, what keeps folks who are directly engaged already away from kind of despair, I think maybe is what you're asking. So, I mean, I think that there are a lot of exciting things happening. I think building on that and keeping the base fired up, but also keeping just an eye on the prize in the future on moving forward. So it's not just a matter of resistance. It's not just a matter of reacting to what is happening and not a matter of just being angry about it, but also keeping the base motivated to move forward and talk about the solutions, to talk about, even though it might seem like it's really far in the future right now, talk about reform and a roadmap to citizenship, which we know is going to be the solution that we all really need. To talk about even the incremental solutions in between there, what will help to make to welcome refugees into our communities, what will help to really what will help our border communities instead of a wall. To talk about what we need to move toward instead of what we just need to resist against, and what we also need to move away from. So we need to be moving forward and towards something at all points. And I think that using that energy to keep the base motivated in a positive way is really going to be key in the next few months.
Anyone want to add anything to that? No, she covered everything. So one little nugget of a question here. How can we, in our day-to-day interactions and conversations, begin to rebrand the word immigrant? Everyone is thinking. Julie?
I have one thought on this. Should I go? Okay. One thing, sometimes we say immigrant community, and I think that puts people apart, as if the immigrants live over here and then everybody else lives over here. So I would encourage people to be really careful. Very pro-immigrant people say it all the time. Well, the immigrant community wants X, Y, and I just think that that's very othering. So that's one thing I would put out there is don't use that phrase.
Yeah, and I was just going to say that I think that we can move away from just try to think of other ways to refer to people who are immigrants, to remind people that they're also mothers and fathers, parents, school, kids, our neighbors, our coworkers, all of these different things. We all have multiple identities, and immigrant is just one identity that all those folks have. And so how can we just remind people of the roundness and fullness of everyone's humanity? And also for us not to avoid the word immigrant or migrant. I mean, people move for all sorts of reasons. It's a natural thing that happens. It's not a bad word. It's not a bad thing by any means. And I think that the conversation right now often acts as though that. I mean, even talking about immigration reform, for instance, it's policy reform, right? We don't need to reform immigration. Immigration is something that happens, and that's fine and that's good. And so I think that just reminding ourselves of how to talk about it and to talk more clearly about what really is happening is a good idea as well.
And a couple people were asking about in these interactions, especially with those who maybe very much on the other side, is it mostly about listening? I mean, just give us some advice on how to gain entry into their thinking to just try to open them up a little bit. I know we need to talk about what we have in common, look for some sort of common values. Family is always a great place to start. What else would you all suggest? Marissa, I see you nodding.
Well, I mean, I think we know what's in their minds. The swamp of immigration, for the most part, that has a lot of, I think that pretty fully maps what's out there and the way people think about immigration. And as I said earlier, I think, the sort of security and control or the us versus them things might be the most prominent for somebody who voted for Trump, for instance. But they also still have access to those people are people, we're Americans who can make things fit ways of thinking. So I think listening is good, but you should also be doing some talking and using the values that we talked about, the humanitarian values and the pragmatic values in conversation are really critical. Don't expect to change people's minds in the first conversation necessarily. These are conversations that you need to have over and over and over again. And that's why, again, Framing well in high doses is the way things work best in terms of changing the conversation.
Anyone else? Lynn, it's on the tip of your tongue.
I know, I just feel like I'm talking too much, but I just wanted to say that I think this is another area where experience matters, and if you can create ways for people who were born in your state or in this country to interact with immigrants, it just, it opens people's minds. So just to state the obvious, they say a picture tells 1,000 words, but a relationship with somebody is I think really powerful in terms of shifting the way people think about the policy debate.
And I would add, just to stay calm, kind, and compassionate, even though it can be hard, and to listen to their feelings and acknowledge them, even though sometimes that's hard to do. It's an important part of having the conversation, and then bring in all the strategies we talked about today in addition.
So we are all fired up, and everyone who's joined this webinar wanted very concrete advice on what to do going forward. I think there are a lot of people who feel a real sense of urgency, whether they're immigrant or not, and want to take action. So as communications professionals, each of you, very succinctly, give us one actionable step that you will give attendees here today that they can do as soon as this webinar is over to help change the conversation on immigration. So Julie, can we start with you?
Hi, Julie. Yeah, so I think one concrete step is to take a look at your current communications, take a look at what you're currently saying and what you intend to be saying in the next few months, and be really intentional about it. Really think through, what are the conversations that are happening, where can I engage, who can I engage with, where can I start, and then how can I put some of these things into play? How can I change what I'm doing right now if it doesn't seem to be
Julie, I think we lost you there. All right, Lynn, you want to go?
Yeah, write a letter to the editor. Go to the website of your local paper. There will be instructions. Make sure you keep it to the word limit. You can use the framework's language. Go to their framework's website and go to their immigration section and pull some of the language from there, and just practice using the framing techniques. And submit it. Submit the letter to the editor and get it published, and then send it to me, and we'll help publicize it broadly.
So just take a look at some of your communications materials and make sure that you're modeling the kind of positive communications that we talked about today.
And I don't want to sound flippant, but never retweet or repeat Donald Trump or anybody else who is telling lies about immigrants. Do not get stuck in that myth-fact trap. Start with the fact and don't repeat the lie.
Start with the facts. That's one of the key things that we learned in today's webinar. Thank you very much, all four experts on telling us how to get this narrative back on track. Dr. Mercer Pinault, Hannah Carswell, Lynn Tremonte, and Julie Fisher-Rao, thank you so much for your time. Would attendees join me in giving them a virtual round of applause? If we only had emojis on this thing, it would work. But so thank you so much for doing that. Just to wrap up, today we learned, don't repeat the myth when you're refuting it, as Marissa just said. Always start with a fact. People tend to remember the myth, not the fact. We need to be solution-oriented, and this is a very important point. Make sure that these solutions offer that complete narrative, like a shared prosperity narrative. It puts a lot of the onus on us to have this sort of comprehensive narrative to combat a soundbite or a talking point, but this is what we need to do in order to take back the narrative. It involves that kind of work. And as people question facts more and more, We have to frame our facts and data in terms of values and stories that highlight these values. Do not expect facts to speak for themselves.